Well, thank you to Lynn and Justin and to Heather and Donna. Before that, um, it's dawned on me that good morning, welcome, sorry. um, just ready to jump in. And I realized I've made one of these really, really tragic preaching mistakes and chosen a whole bunch of things that I really like a lot and don't have all the time in the world to tell you about all of these things. So I'm going to try to stick to my script and and keep us a little on schedule. But this morning, we're in this series on why I'm still here. And I've been so struck by the different talks that we've had in this series so far of hearing different people's perspectives and experiences and kind of the diversity of those, but how often those resonate with us, with me, with others, which was one of the reasons we wanted to do it, and to also help people see that there's other people who kind of ask the same things and wonder the same things. And so hopefully this morning that will be true for you as well. As I was thinking about beginning, I have like 10 different points that I could make, and I will narrow it to 3. And 4 if you come to sermon talk. So there's a little bit of teaser. One that I just last night decided it wasn't going to fit. But I wanted to actually start with a reflection on a real disruption to my thinking that happened 12-ish years ago, I suppose. It was when I was on sabbatical. So it was when I was in 2009 or 2010. And I was working with a spiritual director at the time. And I was on sabbatical, so I was processing a lot and thinking about everything in my life, and was reflecting on how things were not working out the way I sort of anticipated or thought that they should. And this spiritual director, I can't remember if he posed it as a question or made it as a statement. I remember the statement of it. But the gist of it was that he said to me, the universe is not a machine. And it struck me because I really want the universe to be a machine where if you do something, something will happen. That's what I mean by a machine, right? Like there's a logical consequence to everything. So if you are good, a good thing will happen. If you're bad, a bad thing will happen. That would make sense to me in my kind of limited knowledge. I am not a philosopher, so I've only got so much capacity for taking on these complex things. But what struck me is not only that it wasn't what I wanted to hear, but it was entirely true. And it stuck with me so significantly that I can point to like where I was sitting when I had the conversation. And I think it has drastically shaped the way I approach life. And it's probably part of why I'm still here. So I guess what I want to say is that was what I've come to see isn't how it is, right? And so there's some then of maybe a little bit of how I see how it is different from this. And that's what I want to tell you about. Three things. I also chose texts that I really, really like, and I've written about and I've preached on. And so it's hard every one of those, in my opinion, deserves an entire treatment. But I will touch on them as we go. 3 reasons, anyway, that I am a person of faith, that I'm a Christian, that I identify as part of the church. So the first is, I believe there is a really good God. So the God that we heard about in these stories this morning, kind of this God that we read about in the Bible, but also the God that we think about when we look at the stars and we just think about our place in the universe. Or the God that when we're walking in the forest, it just feels like I'm not alone right now. Or this sense of connectedness that we have when we're creating something and there's something going on inside of us as things are coming out of us, whether it's drawings or paintings or whatever, sewing, and we're like, there's more, like I'm connecting right now to something. This holy other we read about, that cultures have acknowledged or wondered about or worshipped around the world and throughout history. That being said, does any culture or religion have the only understanding of God? I'm gonna say no, including us. Might someone outside of our church, someone outside of faith or even religion, have a sense of God and what God is like? Absolutely. I think we probably all know people who have a sense of God, but they don't put it into the kind of box that we usually live with. Could they even have a better understanding than me? Probably. But I'm here because I believe that this God, or to point, is the sum of all love and is characterized and motivated by love. A God who desires relationship with us, between us, that causes us to be full of love too and to share that in the world and to others in kind of partnership with this God. And I believe that this God, one could say, looks like Jesus, or Jesus is kind of what God looks like if God became a person. That's actually how the New Testament describes Jesus. He took on flesh, he incarnated, he became a person. Probably so that we have a little bit of a handle on what this invisible, eternal love God would look like in our terms. I've seen this God at work. I've seen people's lives, I've seen my own life changed by an encounter with God. Perfectly? No. 100%? No. Instantaneously? Not always. Sometimes, yes. Dramatically, yes. It's not a formula, so it's not the machine God that I wish. It's this relational God who interacts with each of us differently, and we interact and hear and feel differently. I feel confident that I've heard this God. Like audibly. And I know a lot of people are like, well, I'm not me, you're weird and that's crazy. Sometimes, yes, I agree with that too. And I will not vouch for anyone else, I'm just speaking for myself here, to say that there are some times that I can point to in my life where I was so confident that God was saying something to me that it changed the trajectory of my life for the better. Again, some of these I can point to, on a leadership retreat with Fresno Pacific College, of all places, in 1994. Like, I can point to the day and time when I felt like God said a specific thing that dramatically changed my life. At a conference with a person. So we don't all hear God this way, or we don't always have these dramatic things. I want to say that, I guess. Because so often I think we, whatever it is that worked for us, we gotta, that should work for you too, how I hear God or feel God or communicate with God. But again, it's not a machine. It's different for each of us. And I've seen this real difference that Jesus has made in people's lives, bringing freedom and peace, wholeness, healing. And around the world, I've had the fortune of having been able to live in different places and work in different places, and many of you have too. And so you can attest to the same, that God is at work kind of all over. Like, we don't have any sort of ownership of that, or best knowledge of that, for that matter. Now, yes, I will acknowledge that there are some really bad things colonialism, patriarchy, fundamentalism, abuse, that are very real and true. So I don't want to say, I'm not whitewashing any of those things. I'm saying, yes, absolutely, those are there. But that doesn't also mean that God is at work and God is real. I don't think they're one and the same. And I think we've had some conversations about this recently where many people, maybe you, were so disappointed or hurt by the church that we kind of walk away from God too, because we see them sort of as one and the same. And I think a lot of us can probably relate to that. We're like, ugh, that is yucky and gross. I believe there is this God of love who's at work that's kind of bigger and better than those things that are limited boxes and words and terms can't say enough. We make boundaries and want everyone to kind of see it our own way. So let's just pretend that it's possible that there is a God, even though we get God wrong a lot, or we understand, or we represent very poorly. That's one. I think it's really important because my experience is probably different from your experience. And my understanding doesn't have to be the exact same as yours. My understanding doesn't have to be the exact same as yours for us to talk and to share and to experience. Because if there is this God, this loving God, then certainly this loving God would be far more than I can imagine. I'm going to always have my limitations in trying to describe what this God is like. It says, if I were to write about all that God was, there would be not enough pages to write, and I think that's one of the reasons that I'm here. But kind of second to that, or along with that, I feel like a second reason that I am here is that this great and loving God also seems to give us a lot of room and freedom. So this Genesis story about Jacob wrestling is one of my favorites, and Stan Kloss and I pretty much talk about this weekly, so I'm indebted to some of Stan's thoughts, melded together with my thoughts. So I'm not going to exposit on that entire text, but referring back to it, we have this story of Jacob, this kind of schemy brother who is always kind of doing things to manipulate the situations, who is alone. He's alone because he's sent his family on, because it's part of this plan and it's a part of a bigger story in that text. But he wrestles alone with God, which I think is interesting because I think often when we wrestle, it's alone. That's something about the nature of wrestling and struggling that pulls us and isolates us. So he's wrestling, it says, like all night. Like it's not like, obviously this is a story, so it's meant to teach us something, but wrestling all night, that is a really long time to wrestle. I wouldn't want to wrestle Nathan more than an hour, maybe more than 10 minutes, much less, all night. And he continues to wrestle even after being injured. There's so much about this human condition in this story of how we always keep fighting even though we should stop and rest. And that's my other sermon, I guess. But it's like a real commitment to wrestling, I guess, is what I want to say. And then in the end, I think Lynn read this part, that God changes his name from Jacob, which has meant supplanter or usurper. Like that's his name his whole life. He's been called supplanter because he was going to be fighting to take over his brother's stuff. But instead, the name becomes wrestles with God. So now your name is wrestles with God, and now you've got a limp and scars, and he marks the place where I saw God. And what I love about this story, Nathan said it, Our wrestling doesn't bother God. This is what I love. Our wrestling doesn't bother God. In fact, I think the story sort of illustrates that God even expects it. God sort of praises it, if you will. I mean, he uses it for the name. So it's not just a casual statement. It's like, you are now this. And this is the name that's given to God's people in the biblical narrative, those who wrestle with God. I mean, we don't really think about that. We just think of Israel. But the whole story is about people who wrestle with God. And then we're now part of that story as people who wrestle with God. And so you see this in all these stories and characters from Abraham all the way to Jesus in Gethsemane, who wrestles with God about what needs to happen. We see it in the text of the Old Testament, like the Psalms, wrestling with God, or lament. I love one of the things that I like about this church is we talk about lament as a legitimate part of our relationship with God, where we say, this isn't how it's supposed to be. Like, I like being part of a church and a faith tradition where we can just say, this isn't how it's supposed to be. We don't have to pretend like everything's different than it is. It's not how it's supposed to be. God is open to challenge, to questions. Is that how we think of God? It doesn't bother God. It's not a deterrent. And I think I like that. So this kind of goes with my God is not a machine where I just do the right thing. There is a bit of a religions, I think, and churches that don't let you ask questions or actively discourage wondering, that doesn't fit with this picture of God. It's about them and their need to control, isn't it? People need to be able to wrestle because the world is not always great. Our individual circumstances are not always good. We need to be able to say, what is going on? I had a friend, kind of in some of the last years that we were in Cape Town, who had been involved with church ministry, and life took its courses and did different things and moved around and basically sort of ended up outside of any normal traditional church, but came to a point of real crisis in their life and related to their family. And we ended up chatting because we were on a trivia team together. I always want to promote Pub Quiz. I know you probably have heard this from me several times, but we were on we did trivia nights together, and he knew me from this, and he knew just enough about me to know that I was some kind of spiritual person who worked in a church. I mean, he had been there, so he kind of knew. And so we developed this long string of conversations where he could wrestle because he needed someone to talk to, and he didn't feel like the churches around him were places where he could ask his questions. Very real questions, the kinds of questions that you and I have. God loves and values thinking. And sometimes that means then that other people will think differently than us, or our own thinking will change over time. And God's okay with that. God doesn't mind the wrestles. There is this amazing diversity of expression that is possible as a result. And I think it's indicative of God as well. And I'm here because of this, because God gives us a lot of room to be ourselves and for others to be themselves. There's room for you. There's room for me. I know we don't always get that right. And we don't always experience that in relationships, in church contexts. But I hope we're growing in it at least, and I hope we're open to it. But maybe you're saying, You don't know about me. I'm kind of icky, you know? You don't know what I've done or where I've been or who I am or the real me. I had a friend, Steve and I had a friend growing up who was taught that he couldn't go to church, couldn't approach God until he first got his act together. Essentially, you're too sinful for God to pay attention to until you sort of get sorted out, and then you can come. Anyone familiar with that kind of approach? It's tragic because it's sort of the exact opposite, in my opinion. And sometimes we put other people into that camp, right? Well, not those people, though, right? If it's not me, it's like, well, they're also not. They can't possibly be loved or fine. Yes, even them and even us, even me, even you. So I guess the third reason that kind of comes from that I'm still here is because God doesn't just make room for us. He doesn't just kind of tolerate us or allow it. He actually loves and forgives and reaches toward us. Even when, or maybe especially when, we feel we don't deserve it. The reason I'm part of this faith tradition is because there is a God who reaches toward us when we don't feel that we deserve it. So this John text, one of my favorite stories, I picked just a bunch of my favorite stories for this, but about this woman at the well, which you'll notice in the story is Jacob's well. So Jacob from our first text, right? Came across, named this place, ancestors were here. So there's this thread of people. So it takes place in Samaria, so it takes place outside of Israel. And this woman comes and asks for a drink, and it's this very countercultural, this isn't supposed to happen kind of moment in the middle of the day, etc. And I love that Jesus is vulnerable to this woman, and asks for something. And I love that Jesus comes to places where people are. So he comes to a well in the middle of the day to meet a person that otherwise probably wouldn't have an encounter with. And he talks about this living water, and there's this last little bit about, go get your husband. And she's like, I'm married 5 times. And Jesus knows this, apparently. He doesn't just kind of do all this in ignorance. He knows, and he is compassionate, and he's honest, and he's loving, and he's vulnerable. And this is the person, one of the people that Jesus chooses to kind of explicitly say who he is. I am the Messiah. You're right. Hey, I'm that, He doesn't say that to very many people. And God seems to have a habit of doing this, of appearing to the oddballs. Do we say that word anymore? People like me, you. Working through the weak people, spending time with the broken ones. And so I love this story because to me it's the epitome of Jesus, who is loving and goes to a person sort of out of the way in an out of the way place, and it gives me hope. I'm thankful for it. I can relate to it. I know I've needed it. Sometimes I feel like I'm not that person, but really I am. Maybe that's why I like this story so much. I'm that woman. I could have picked any number of stories to tell here, but when after 20 years of marriage, my marriage came apart, and that's a longer story than that, but I will just leave it at that. I was living overseas, have 3 kids. I felt like an absolute failure of a person, and really felt shame, and was aware of these repercussions or waves of things that took place as a result of this action here. People I had disappointed. And I came face to face with my own theology, growing up in a pretty standard conservative evangelical church, where when one makes a covenant or a vow, it's no matter what, forever, no matter what. And I got to the what in the story. And I think part of the shame came from my own wrestling with what I thought God thought of me. Like I'm now, maybe it's father issues, I don't know, but I'm not living up to this standard that I'm supposed to have been able to do. What a failure I am. I can't do anything anymore. This invalidates everything about me. That's what I thought. That's what I'd been taught. And two things, like here, saved me, really. One, God. Saying to me, it's okay if you fail. Now, you don't all know me from, some of you do, know me from before. That's not a thing. Like, it's not okay to fail. Like, that is not how I've lived my life. Like, you succeed or that's it, Well, this is a big fail. And for God to say, you're not me. It's okay. You're limited and you're a human. So sure, there's an ideal, and strive for that ideal and live for that ideal, but if you don't reach it, it's not the end. And really feeling God saying and communicating and expressing, I love you. It's hard to say I love you to someone who's in this place. I find it hard, maybe because I've been in. God saying, yes, this is horrible, but I'm here. And others saying, I'm sorry. What happened? Are you okay? How can I help? Leaning in just enough, laying back just enough. There's other stories like that too, and you probably have them. And I know that many of us have experienced the opposite. When we're hurting or get it wrong, we feel judged or excluded or less than. People get this wrong with others, like regularly, I would say. And both ways, giving and receiving. But I think the good news is not God. That's what we see in this great and loving God that we see here in Jesus, in this story, and all the stories about him. He says, I know. But Psalm 139, I know you, and I love you. Oh, that's really hard for me to accept. I think that's the gospel. I love you. Let's try again when you're ready. I'm here. And God did that in my case and has done some great things. But healing, new love. So for most of us, this is felt and experienced most tangibly in relationships and in community. Sure, there's those moments when we feel like maybe God is directly wrapping God's arms around us. I hope that you've experienced that in the middle of all the have not experienced that. Because I know that's what God wants. And I hope this community is one where you experience that. More often than not, anyway. I hope that we can live this way with one another and with others. That's one of the reasons that I'm here. That's the kind of community that I believe in and want to be part of and see glimpses of and glorious moments of. I almost cried this morning just watching the readings and seeing the different people up here doing it together. So ultimately, I suppose if I were to sum this all up, if you're still here, I guess I'm here because of Jesus. I mean, that's sort of they could have saved a lot of time, but because Jesus shows us how good God is. It's not just this ethereal concept. Jesus shows us that. Jesus comes and speaks and changes our lives and the world. And Jesus shows us how open and inviting God is. And if anyone tries to teach you that God isn't, then I would say, then look at Jesus, because there's no way around it. He comes and he's open and he's loving and he's forgiving and he's accepting. He shows us that we can be ourselves and we can wrestle with God. He demonstrates this love. He models this radical acceptance and empowers us to do the same. And that all sounds really good to me. And that's why I'm still here.